I'm worth $100 million and I rent instead of buying. Before you scroll away thinking this is another rich person's humble brag, let me tell you why this decision haunts me every single day and why it might be the most important thing you ever hear about money, ownership, and what it truly means to be free. I built my fortune in tech. Started with nothing but a laptop and a dream in my parents' garage in San Jose. The usual Silicon Valley story, you might think. But what happened next changed everything I thought I knew about success, happiness, and the American dream itself. I remember the exact moment I realized I was worth 9 figures. It was 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in March 2019. I was sitting in my rented apartment, a modest 2-bedroom in Soma that cost me $8,000 a month, staring at my laptop screen. The acquisition had just closed. My company, which started as a simple app to help people track their daily habits, had just been purchased by a tech giant for $847 million. After all the lawyers, taxes, and investor payouts, my personal share came to just over $100 million. I should have been ecstatic. I should have been calling everyone I knew. I should have been planning the mansion I'd buy in Atherton or the penthouse overlooking the Golden Gate Bridge. Instead, I felt this overwhelming sense of emptiness, like I'd won a game I never really wanted to play. The first thing people asked me, once word got out, was always the same. So where are you buying? Not if, where? Because when you have that kind of money, ownership isn't just expected, it's assumed to be automatic. It's the natural progression. You struggle, you succeed, you buy things, bigger things, more expensive things, things that prove you've made it. But here's what nobody tells you about sudden wealth. It doesn't change who you are inside. It just amplifies it. And what got amplified in me wasn't greed or materialism. It was fear. Deep, paralyzing fear about making the wrong choice, about being trapped, about losing the very freedom that money was supposed to give me. You see, I grew up poor. Not just we don't have money for vacation, poor, but choosing between electricity and groceries, poor. When we own something, my father would say in his broken English, nobody can take it away. They eventually did buy a small house in a questionable neighborhood in Oakland. It was 980 square feet, needed a new roof, and the plumbing made sounds like dying animals, but it was theirs. I watched my parents pour every spare moment and dollar into that house for 15 years. They painted and repainted, fixed and refixed, upgraded and maintained. The house owned them more than they owned it. And then, when I was 26 and just starting to find success with my first startup, they lost it anyway. My father had a stroke. The medical bills piled up faster than you could imagine. Even with insurance, the costs were astronomical. They tried to hold on, refinancing twice, taking out loans against the equity they had built. But in the end, they had to sell. The house that was supposed to represent security, freedom, the American dream, it became the anchor that dragged them under when they needed liquidity the most. I watched my father cry the day they handed over the keys. This man who had worked 18-hour days for decades, who had sacrificed everything for the promise of ownership, sitting in our empty living room with tears streaming down his face. It's just a house, my mother kept saying, but we all knew it wasn't. It was their identity, their proof of success, their piece of America. That image never left me. So when I found myself with more money than I could spend in several lifetimes, the idea of buying property, of tying myself down to any single place or thing, filled me with dread. What if I made the wrong choice? What if the market crashed? What if I needed the money for something else? What if I wanted to move? What if? The rational part of my brain knew the arguments for buying. I had financial advisors showing me spreadsheets proving that ownership would be the optimal financial decision. You're throwing money away on rent, they'd say. You could buy a mansion for what you're spending on rent in 5 years. The math was indisputable, but math doesn't account for psychology. It doesn't factor in the weight of regret or the value of flexibility. I decided to conduct an experiment. I would rent the most luxurious places I could find in different cities around the world and see if the experience of high-end living would change my perspective. Maybe I'd fall in love with a particular place and want to make it permanent. Maybe I'd find that home where I belonged. My first rental was a $25,000 per month penthouse in Manhattan, floor-to-ceiling windows, private elevator, rooftop garden. The building had a concierge who knew my name within a week and a doorman who could source impossible-to-get restaurant reservations with a single phone call. The apartment came fully furnished by an interior designer whose work I'd seen in Architectural Digest. It was, by any objective measure, perfect. I lived there for 6 months and felt like I was staying in an expensive hotel. Beautiful, certainly. Impressive, absolutely. But it never felt like mine. Not because I was renting, I could have bought it easily, but because it reflected someone else's taste, someone else's vision of what luxury should look like. I was a visitor in my own life. Next, I tried Los Angeles, a modernist glass house in the hills that rented for $30,000 a month, infinity pool, walls that disappeared at the touch of a button, smart home technology that anticipated my every need. I hosted parties there, invited friends and family to visit. Everyone was amazed. "This is living," they'd say. But at night, when everyone went home, I'd sit by that infinity pool looking out over the city lights and feel infinitely alone. The problem wasn't the places, the problem was me. I was searching for something that ownership was supposed to provide: identity, belonging, roots, but I was looking in all the wrong places. I thought maybe if I spent enough money, if the views were spectacular enough, if the amenities were luxurious enough, I'd suddenly feel at home. After 18 months of this lifestyle, I made a decision that surprised even me. I rented a modest apartment in Portland, Oregon. 2 bedrooms, nothing fancy, $3,200 a month. My friends thought I'd lost my mind. My financial advisors staged what amounted to an intervention, but something about the simplicity appealed to me. No concierge, no doorman, no infinity pool, just a place to live. And for the first time since I'd become wealthy, I started to feel human again. The apartment was in an old building with character. Hardwood floors that creaked, windows that stuck sometimes, radiators that clanged in the winter. The neighbors were artists, teachers, small business owners, people who chose their professions for love rather than money. I'd run into them in the hallway and we'd have conversations about books, local restaurants, the weather. Normal conversations. Nobody knew who I was or how much money I had. I was just Marcus from 4B. I started shopping at the local grocery store, walking to nearby coffee shops, exploring the city on foot. I bought furniture, not expensive designer pieces, but things I actually liked. A vintage leather chair from an estate sale. A wooden desk I found at an antique market. Books, lots of books, because I had time to read again. For 6 months, I lived what felt like a normal life. I worked on small personal projects, learned to cook, started playing guitar again for the first time since college. I dated a woman named Sarah who worked at a non-profit downtown. She had no idea about my net worth, thought I was just another tech worker who could afford a decent apartment. Our relationship was wonderfully uncomplicated. We'd split dinner checks, go to free concerts in the park, stay in and watch movies. It was the happiest I'd been in years. But even in this simpler life, the question of buying versus renting followed me. Sarah and I were getting serious, and she started talking about our future. "Maybe we should think about getting a place together," she'd say. "I hate the idea of just throwing money away on rent when we could be building equity." The practical advice everyone gives about real estate is true, mathematically. If you're going to stay in a place for more than a few years, if you have stable income, if the market is reasonable, buying is usually the better financial decision. But what they don't tell you is that buying changes everything about how you see yourself and your life. It's not just a financial transaction, it's a statement about who you think you are and what you think you want. When you rent, you're fluid, adaptable, free to chase opportunities, to change your mind, to follow your heart. When you buy, you're planted, rooted, committed. For some people, that's exactly what they need. For others, like me, it feels like choosing a cage, even if it's a golden one. Sarah and I did start looking at houses together. Portland's market was hot, but not insane like San Francisco. We could afford something nice, maybe not a mansion, but a beautiful home with character in a good neighborhood. We spent weekends going to open houses, imagining our life together in each space. "This could be the guest room," she'd say, or "we could put a garden here." I wanted to share her excitement, I really did, but every house we looked at felt like a trap. Not because of Sora or the commitment to her, I loved her deeply, but because of the commitment to place, to permanence, to a vision of the future that I couldn't fully embrace. What I hadn't told Sarah, what I hadn't told anyone, was the real reason I was afraid of buying property. It wasn't just the childhood trauma of watching my parents lose their house, though that was part of it. It was something deeper, something I'd been running from since the day I became wealthy. I was afraid that if I bought a house, if I accumulated possessions, if I built a life around things instead of experiences and relationships, I'd become someone I didn't recognize. I'd watched it happen to friends who'd achieved success before me. They'd buy the house, then they'd need to fill it with furniture, art, gadgets. They'd need to maintain it, secure it, insure it. The house would need to be impressive enough for their status, in the right neighborhood for their image, large enough for their ambitions. Before long, they weren't living their lives. They were maintaining their lives. The possessions possessed them. They made career decisions based on mortgage payments instead of passion. They stayed in relationships because they couldn't afford to divorce. They worked jobs they hated to pay for houses they rarely had time to enjoy. I'd seen friends become prisoners of their own success, and I was terrified of following the same path. So I made a decision that ended my relationship with Sarah and confused everyone who knew me. I decided to embrace radical mobility. Instead of buying one expensive house, I would rent different places around the world. I'd live like a nomad, but a comfortable one. I'd work remotely, experience different cultures, and never stay anywhere long enough to feel trapped. It sounded romantic in theory. In practice, it was exhausting. I spent the next 3 years living everywhere and belonging nowhere. 3 months in Tokyo in a minimalist apartment in Shibuya. 6 months in a canal house in Amsterdam. A season in a beachfront villa in Tulum. 2 months in a converted warehouse loft in Berlin. Each place was beautiful, each experience was enriching, but I was beginning to understand the difference between being free and being unmoored. The problem with constant mobility is that it becomes its own kind of prison. You're always the outsider, always the visitor, always explaining where you're from and what you're doing. You make friends, but then you leave them. You find favorite restaurants, but then you move on. You never develop deep roots anywhere, which means you never develop a deep sense of self anywhere. I was having lunch with an old friend in Barcelona. I was renting a modernist apartment in El Born at the time, when he asked me a question that stopped me cold. Marcus, when you think of home, what do you picture? I sat there for a long moment, fork halfway to my mouth, realizing I didn't have an answer. I could describe the various places I'd lived, the cities I'd loved, the experiences I'd had. But home was a concept that had become foreign to me. I was a man with $100 million who could buy any house in the world, but I couldn't picture a single place I'd call home. That night, I called my parents for the first time in months. We'd grown distant since I'd become wealthy, not out of any malice, but because my life had become impossible for them to relate to. They were proud of my success, but confused by my choices. "Why don't you buy a nice house and settle down?" my mother would ask. "What are you running from?"
"Mom," I said, "do you ever regret buying the house in Oakland?" There was a long pause. "Which part?" she asked. "Buying it or losing it?" "Either." "Both." Another pause. "Marcus, we had 15 good years in that house. Your sister took her first steps in the living room. You learned to ride your bike in the driveway. We had birthday parties and Christmas mornings and family dinners. We had a life there. When we lost it, we lost those 15 years. But we lost them to medical bills and bad luck. Not because owning was wrong. We lost them because life is unpredictable and sometimes unfair. But if we'd been renting that whole time, moving every few years, we wouldn't have had those 15 years to lose. We would have had 15 years of temporary, and temporary is not the same as free." After that conversation, I started to reconsider everything. Maybe the problem wasn't ownership versus renting. Maybe the problem was that I'd been thinking of it as an all-or-nothing choice, either complete freedom or total commitment, either nomadic mobility or suburban imprisonment. But life isn't binary like that. Most meaningful choices exist somewhere in the gray area between extremes. I started thinking about what I actually wanted from a home, not what society expected, not what my advisors recommended, not what would impress people, but what would make me genuinely happy and fulfilled. The answer, when I finally allowed myself to think about it honestly, was surprisingly simple. I wanted a place where I could be creative. I wanted space to work on projects that mattered to me, not just profitable ones. I wanted a kitchen where I could cook for friends, a garden where I could grow something with my own hands, a room full of books, a comfortable chair where I could read them. I wanted to know my neighbors' names and have them know mine. I wanted to be part of a community, not just a consumer of experiences, but I also wanted flexibility. I didn't want to feel trapped if opportunities arose to travel, or if I decided I wanted to live somewhere else for a while. I didn't want my entire net worth tied up in illiquid assets if the markets crashed, or if I wanted to invest in new ventures. I didn't want to spend my weekends maintaining property instead of living life. So I developed what I call the hybrid approach. Instead of buying one expensive primary residence, I would rent a modest place in a city I loved and use the money I would have spent on a mansion to fund experiences, relationships, and opportunities that mattered to me. I chose Seattle after months of research and short-term stays. The city had everything I was looking for: a strong tech community for work opportunities, natural beauty for inspiration, excellent food and culture, and a vibe that valued authenticity over ostentation. I found a 2-bedroom apartment in Capitol Hill, not the fanciest neighborhood, but one with character and community. The rent was $4,500 a month, a fraction of what I'd been spending on luxury rentals around the world. But here's the key. Instead of thinking of that rent as money thrown away, I started thinking of it as payment for flexibility and freedom from the responsibilities of ownership. I was paying for the right to leave if I wanted to, for someone else to handle maintenance and repairs, for the ability to keep my wealth liquid and invested in growing assets instead of tied up in depreciating property. With the money I wasn't spending on a house payment, property taxes, maintenance, and all the stuff you need to fill a big house, I could afford to do things that truly enriched my life. I traveled, but purposefully now, taking 2 or 3 meaningful trips per year instead of constantly moving. I invested in experiences with people I cared about and bringing friends on adventures, funding family vacations, supporting causes I believed in. Most importantly, I started a foundation focused on financial education for young people. Having grown up poor and then becoming wealthy quickly, I understood both sides of the money equation. I knew how poverty could trap you, but I'd also learned how wealth could trap you if you let it. The foundation became my real work, my legacy project, something I was genuinely passionate about. I've been living this way for 4 years now, and I can honestly say I'm happier than I've ever been. My apartment isn't the fanciest place I've ever lived, but it's the first place that's felt like home since I was a child. I know the barista at the coffee shop downstairs. I have dinner with my neighbors sometimes. I'm part of a community garden 2 blocks away. My life has rhythm and routine and relationships that matter. But I also maintain the freedom to be spontaneous. When a friend invited me to spend a month in New Zealand last year, I could say yes without worrying about house maintenance or security systems. When an interesting business opportunity came up that required me to spend several weeks in Austin, I could pack a bag and go without concerns about property management or lawn care. People still think I'm crazy for renting instead of buying, especially given my net worth. Real estate agents call me regularly with perfect properties that would be ideal investments. My accountant sends me quarterly reports showing how much wealth I could have built in property appreciation. Family members hint that I should settle down and buy a proper house befitting my success. But I've learned something important. Wealth isn't about having the most expensive things. It's about having the freedom to make choices based on what makes you happy rather than what you think you should do or what other people expect. True luxury isn't marble countertops or infinity pools. It's the luxury of living authentically on your own terms. That said, I'm not advocating that everyone should rent instead of buy. The right choice depends entirely on your circumstances, your values, your stage of life, and your temperament. For many people, ownership provides exactly what they need: stability, a sense of belonging, a way to build wealth over time, roots in a community. For others like me, those same things feel like chains. The key is being honest about what you actually want, not what you think you should want. Are you buying because it makes financial sense for your situation or because society tells you that's what successful people do? Are you renting because it provides the flexibility you truly value or because you're afraid of making a commitment? There's no universally right answer, only what's right for you. I think about my parents' story often. They lost their house, yes, but my mother was right. They had 15 years of genuine happiness there. They built memories, raised their children, created a life. The fact that they eventually lost it doesn't negate those 15 years. It just means that sometimes life is unfair and unpredictable, which is true whether you own or rent. The difference is that when you own, you're betting that the predictable future you're envisioning will actually come to pass. When you rent, you're betting that flexibility will be more valuable than stability. Both are bets. Both can pay off. Both can disappoint you. I've realized that my fear of ownership was really a fear of commitment, not just financial commitment, but emotional commitment to a vision of my future self. Buying a house forces you to decide who you think you'll be in 5 or 10 years. What neighborhood will still feel right? How much space will you need? What style will still appeal to you? What kind of life are you trying to build? Those are profound questions, and for a long time, I wasn't ready to answer them. I was still figuring out who I was, post-success, post-wealth, post-fame. I needed time and space to discover my authentic self, not the person I thought I should become because I had money. Now at 38, I'm starting to have clearer answers to those questions. I know I want to stay in Seattle for the foreseeable future. I know I want to continue growing my foundation and working on projects that matter socially, not just financially. I know I value community and creativity more than prestige and luxury. I know I want to share my life with someone who loves me for who I am, not what I have. Which brings me to the most recent development in my story. I met someone, her name is Elena, and she's a pediatric nurse at Seattle Children's Hospital. We met at a volunteer event for my foundation. She was there representing a nonprofit that provides financial counseling for families dealing with medical debt. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here was someone who helped families avoid the exact situation my parents had faced. Elena lives in a small house in the Greenwood neighborhood that she bought 3 years ago. It's 1,100 square feet, built in 1946, needs some updates, and she loves it fiercely. It's the first place that's ever really been mine, she told me on our third date. I know that sounds silly, but I grew up moving every couple of years because of my dad's job, and I always dreamed of having a place where I could paint the walls whatever color I wanted and plant flowers that I'd be around to see bloom. We've been together for 8 months now, and she still doesn't know exactly how much money I have. She knows I'm comfortable, knows I sold a company, assumes I'm probably worth a few million. The specifics don't seem to matter to her, which is part of why I love her. She judges me based on how I treat people, what I choose to do with my time, whether I show up when I say I will. Last week, she asked if I ever think about buying a place of my own. Not a place for us, we're not there yet, but a place for me. Don't you want to be building equity instead of paying someone else's mortgage? She asked, the same question everyone asks. I found myself giving her an answer I'd never articulated before. I could buy any house I want tomorrow with cash. That's not the issue. The issue is that I've learned the difference between having money and being wealthy. Having money means you can afford things. Being wealthy means you have the freedom to choose what matters to you instead of what's expected of you. For me, right now, renting gives me more wealth than owning would. She thought about that for a long moment. But what if what matters to you changes? What if you decide you want roots? What if you want to paint the walls whatever color you want and plant flowers you'll be around to see bloom? It was a good question. Maybe the best question anyone had ever asked me about this whole dilemma. Then I'll buy a house, I said. Not because it's what successful people do, not because it's the optimal financial strategy, not because everyone expects me to, but because it's what I want. Because it serves the life I'm trying to build instead of forcing me to build a life that serves it. That conversation happened 3 days ago, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. For the first time since I became wealthy, I can actually picture a future that includes ownership. Not a mansion in Atherton or a penthouse in Manhattan, but a house, a home, a place where Ellen and I could build something together. It wouldn't be about the investment potential or the status symbol or even the financial math. It would be about creating a space for the life we want to live, a place where we could host friends, start a family if we decide we want one, contribute to a community, put down roots, a place that reflects our values and supports our dreams instead of requiring us to sacrifice them. But I'm not there yet. I'm still learning to trust my own instincts about what I want instead of reacting against what I think I should want. I'm still figuring out the difference between choosing commitment and having commitment thrust upon me. I'm still discovering what home means to me as an adult, not just what it meant to the child who watched his parents lose theirs. What I know for certain is this: the rent versus buy decision isn't really about money, even though that's how we usually frame it. It's about identity. It's about values. It's about what kind of life you're trying to build and what trade-offs you're willing to make to build it. For some people, ownership provides security, pride, a sense of belonging, a way to build generational wealth. For others, it represents obligation, limitation, financial risk, pressure to maintain a lifestyle that might not align with their true priorities. Neither choice is inherently superior. Both come with benefits and costs, both financial and emotional. The key is being honest about which benefits matter most to you and which costs you're most capable of bearing. I spent years running from ownership because I associated it with my parents' pain and my own fear of being trapped. But maybe the real trap was in thinking of it as a trap. Maybe ownership, chosen thoughtfully and for the right reasons, can be just another form of freedom. The freedom to put down roots, to build something lasting, to stop running from commitment and start running toward it. I'm not saying I'm ready to buy a house tomorrow, but I'm saying that for the first time in my adult life, the idea doesn't terrify me. It actually excites me. A little. The thought of choosing a place with Elena, of making it ours, of building a life there together, it feels less like a cage and more like an adventure.
Maybe that's what growing up really means. Not just accumulating wealth or achieving success, but learning to distinguish between the fears that protect you and the fears that imprison you. Learning to choose commitment, not because you have to, but because you want to. Learning that true freedom isn't the absence of ties that bind, but the presence of ties you choose to bind yourself with.
I'm worth $100 million, and I rent instead of buying. For now. But that "for now" is the most important part of that sentence. It means I'm finally free to change my mind. It means I'm finally wealthy enough, emotionally, not just financially, to choose ownership if and when it serves the life I want to live instead of the life I think I should live. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Whether you rent or buy, whether you're worth millions or living paycheck to paycheck, the most important thing is that you're making the choice consciously, deliberately, based on your actual values and circumstances rather than societal expectations or unconscious fears. Money gives you options, but it doesn't give you wisdom about which options to choose. That has to come from somewhere else, from self-knowledge, from experience, from honest reflection about what actually makes you happy versus what you think should make you happy. I'm still figuring it all out. Maybe I always will be. But I'm no longer afraid of the questions, and I'm no longer afraid of my own answers. I'm worth $100 million. I rent instead of buying, and I'm finally at peace with both those facts. Not because they're permanent, but because they're chosen. And choice, I've learned, is the most valuable thing money can buy. The story isn't over. Elaine and I are talking more seriously about our future. My foundation is expanding to new cities. My investment portfolio continues to grow. My relationship with my parents has healed and deepened. I'm considering writing a book about the psychology of sudden wealth and the choices it creates. But most importantly, I'm no longer running from or toward anything. I'm just living day by day, choice by choice, trying to build a life that feels authentic and meaningful and true. Sometimes that means renting. Sometimes it might mean buying. Either way, it means being free enough to choose what serves my happiness rather than what serves my image or my fears or other people's expectations. That's what $100 million has really bought me. Not the ability to buy anything I want, but the ability to choose what I actually want. And right now, what I want is to keep asking the questions, keep having the conversations, keep being open to the possibility that my answers might change as I continue to grow and learn and discover who I'm becoming. The apartment in Capitol Hill is still home for now. The rent check still gets written every month. The freedom to leave is still important to me, but so is the growing certainty that I don't want to leave, at least not anytime soon. And maybe eventually that certainty will be enough to help me choose the beautiful burden of putting down roots. Either way, I'll know I'm choosing consciously, authentically, freely, and that's worth more than any house could ever be.